in my 25 years of living in California, I can honestly say I never saw a wind speed get close to 100 miles an hour. And actually, I was thinking when I was preparing for this conversation with you, there's almost two categories. I think there's wildfire, which you historically thinking of lightning strike in a wilderness area, or I think improvements have been made, but you did have arcing of some electrical lines in high winds that then set brush alight. And I think that's really what people think of when they talk about wildfire. And certainly people like RiskMeter, their whole prediction is based off the proximity to a wilderness area. I think in what we're seeing today, or what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, tragically, whether by accident or deliberate, we hate to say that, we're seeing fires that are breaking out, and it's almost a convective wind fire as opposed to a wildfire, because the Santa Anas are obviously created like a convective windstorm. There's a change in temperature, in this case between the ocean and the land, which causes these offshore breezes. So probably seeing very unique effects from the weather conditions. And how much, if one person protects themselves in an urban area, really how much help is that going to be if the next door neighbor is not going to take the same precautions? That's where I think probably as a modeling company you're challenged.
Absolutely. So that is where a lot of research that we've done in conjunction with IBHS will come into play, because when we're looking at those defensible zones, we're not looking at a parcel level, because to your point, wildfire doesn't care what your property line is. So even if I keep my property well maintained, I have vegetation that is low to the ground, no fuels that are going to be burning very hot next to me, if my neighbor is not, it's still going to affect my home, whether I like it or not. So in that regard, what we're able to do is take that aerial imagery and just expound out from the actual perimeter of your home itself, as opposed to just looking at a parcel line. So we do take into account all of the factors that are around you, whether it's just vegetation or building density, because homes are very closely packed together. If your neighbor ignites, there's ember casts that can happen to your house itself. So those kinds of situations are accounted for. Unfortunately, with the Santa Ana winds that were blowing, it was a very tragic event that occurred. It's not something that is very typical. However, that is something that would be captured within our secondary score for that property level, because if you are very close to other structures or all of the other fuel sources, the things that are burning very hot, you'll have that pushed onto your property as well. And that is accounted for with the style of modeling that is done at Zesty. So being able to pick up on that hazard level in general is great, but also looking at that property level information is very powerful for a situation like this.
And moving up to Northern California, we've been doing quite a lot of research with entities such as Fortress that do fire mitigation on individual properties and homeowners associations and asset hardening, combined with CAL FIRE, who've done a tremendous amount of work in creating fire breaks and clearing old brush and really the undergrowth, which largely fuels some of these wildfires, the true wildfires that break out in these wilderness areas. And then PG&E, very interestingly, have put hundreds of thermal cameras all over Napa and Sonoma. And I think about 77 fires were picked up on those cameras, 22 of which were put out before a 911 call was even made. There's tremendous work, and all of that's been going on over the last 5 years, since the 19 and 2020 fires. How up to date is Zesty in talking to those agencies and those entities and obviously the hardening part of it, and keeping up with what's going on and then tweaking the model?
So within the way that our fire model works, it is that gradient boosted machine learning model. So it has all of those inputs that it looks at holistically, and the way those inputs work together is set. The inputs themselves can change. So if there is a change to a roofing material or there is a clearing of vegetation, that is reflected when we gather new aerial imagery. So you can think that we'll have updated scores if something has changed on roughly 3 to 4 times a year when there is new updated aerial imagery. So for the example of clearing out brush, if CAL FIRE goes through an area and starts to take away all of those fuel sources, once a new plane flies over, we get that imagery, we source it, we're able to mine out the information that we need, and therefore see that there is less fuel around, and the scores will be updated accordingly. So it is very frequent. Those changes, we're able to capture them and actually reflect them in the risk that you're seeing on the property itself. Some things will be a little bit slower. So if there is a change in the overall fuel source or the type of landscaping. So if you're moving from a medium intensity urban area to somewhere that's high developed, those can take a little bit longer to update since those are other sources. But the things that are very localized to you, those update 3 to 4 times a year. So it is very timely and it gives you a very good view of what your present situation is at that property.
I've got to believe now that federal and state governments are going to have to wrap their arms around some of these perils, and we'll stick with wildfire for the time being. And I almost feel that it's going to become a federally backed initiative, similar to the federal flood program. And so I know you've been working with some of the regulatory bodies in certain states. So are you helping them in assessing the risks and to overlay some of these disasters with the model and then give feedback so that they can strategize and plan? And do you personally think that that's where it's going to go, that we'll have a federal disaster account or placement for wildfire like we do with flood?
California Fair Plan does use Zesty AI's Z-Fire model for their rating plan. So I think that speaks very highly of what we're doing over here. We've made the point of the model itself is very transparent. That's one of the great things about the way that the GBM works is it will point out the reasons why you're getting the score that you're getting. So if it's something that's manageable by the insured, they could take those mitigating efforts to help reduce their risk. So that is something that the FAIR plan has really liked. They've adopted us. I think that speaks very highly of the modeling that we do over here. Do I personally think that wildfire will become something that is federally backed? Probably. It just seems that we're having those crazy swings. There's more dry spells, and it's just the fuel is there. And those winds that came out in the Santa Ana winds this time are just they're intense. So having something like that federally backed, I think is probably going to be the way that things will go. I know here in Florida, we have the Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund where we have basically our own pocket of reinsurance. Perhaps California will do something similar. I don't know exactly what will happen there, but I do foresee it becoming just a worse problem in the future.